This 911 Strong podcast is brought to you by our partners at the Police Credit Union of California.
As a financial institution founded by law enforcement for law enforcement and their families over 65 years ago, they have the experience and understanding to help you with all your financial needs,
including exclusive products designed specifically for law enforcement professionals. To become a member today, visit thepolicecu.org. That's the police, the letter C, and the letter U.org.
Or call 800-222-1391 and tell them you heard about them from the 911 Strong podcast.
Station to all units.
Prepare to copy.
You're listening to the 911 Strong podcast.
Don't act like I never told you.
With Aram and Kristen, bringing you stimulating discussion.
No, I like the sound of that.
An entertaining conversation.
And now, here's Kristen and Aram.
Hey friends, welcome back to the 911 Strong podcast. I am Aram Choe, and with me as always is Kristen Jauregui. What's up, Kristen?
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing not too bad.
Back at it.
All right. We on our last episode we had Mason, and Mason was knocked it out of the park exactly where we wanted to go. We didn't really want to harp on Uvalde too much, but we wanted to talk about the realities of what you can do during an active shooter situation. As we all know, shortly after the Uvalde shooting, Tulsa, Oklahoma had a hospital shooting. So really any environment where you have a lot of people in it, you can be exposed to an active shooter situation. And towards the end of that episode, we talked a little bit about what type of medical preparation you can have. And that's something that we don't talk often enough about. So that's why we have our next guest here. You may remember him from a couple episodes ago where we talked about some of the medical stuff that civilians need to learn and officers need to learn. So what a perfect man to have on our show today. We have Ofer. You may know him as Trauma Pack all over social media, but Ofer is a firefighter, paramedic who trains people all over the country on how to address medical issues in emergency situations. So we're so lucky to have you. Thank you for coming on. Welcome to the show, Ofer.
Thank you. Great to be here, guys.
Yeah. So the last time we had you on here, we talked about some of the equipment and stuff like that officers and civilians can carry. And we mentioned the tourniquet. You know, now you're starting to see, if you watch social media and you're in this space where you follow gun guys, now what you see everywhere on a guy's gun belt is a tourniquet. Are you still supportive of that mindset? Should everybody have a tourniquet on them?
So I really think it depends on your environment. So why do I say that? Well, on the battlefield, in areas where an officer, for example, is wearing body armor, then yes, the number one preventable, and that's the key word here, is what is actually preventable? Because the reality is if you're shot with a kill shot, let's say in the head or right in the heart or in an area that we can't fix, then a tourniquet isn't going to do anything. But with body armor, we're seeing, especially in the military and law enforcement, their injuries tend to be more in the extremities or in these little junction areas where the vest kind of comes in. Whereas civilians, we see more injuries in that torso. So I emphasize the environment because an officer, yes, tourniquet is probably going to be the one thing that will save you. Whereas a civilian, it may not be the one thing that will save you. It may come in second or third in kind of the sequence of what I'd love to touch on today is what is actually killing both first responders and both civilians from the same type of injury or same type of environment that's creating these injuries.
Okay, well, let's get into that. Why don't you bring that up?
Sure.
Get us.
Yeah. So if I can just, I was thinking about this as you were talking. If I can, again, I know this is obviously non-rehearsed, but I want to take you back to around 1999, where this concept of CPR really took off, of hands-only CPR and how CPR saved lives. Well, so Chicago O'Hare Airport, massive airport, they were finding that a lot of people were dying from cardiac arrest because it took forever for an ambulance, paramedics to make it from the entry of the airport all the way to wherever that person was. And you're talking, within four minutes, that's too much time for no oxygen for the brain. So what they did was they did this pilot program and they called this the chain of survival for cardiac arrest. So keep that term in mind, the chain of survival. And they trained all the employees at that airport to do CPR. And then they put AEDs strategically about every 30 seconds to a minute apart, because they said, well, if it takes 4 minutes for you to die if you don't have oxygen, if we just put an AED within about 1 minute distance of everywhere, if you were to run 1 minute, run back 1 minute, you're 2 minutes, you still have enough time. Well, their pilot program was so successful, and they increased the survival rate by creating this chain of survival of having bystander CPR, AEDs, people that are trained, all the way down to paramedics show up, and then you take them to the hospital, to the cath lab, and these cardiac arrest numbers were soaring. So that was kind of, let's use that as to set the tone. We failed to do this chain of survival with trauma. And we always rely on, hey, I'm going to call 911. Someone like Kristen's going to pick up. She's going to read off a card, trying to tell me what to do. And that, for example, that always wasn't there as far as like tourniquets were not even recommended years ago for dispatchers to use. So now we have, Kristen dispatching paramedics, officers maybe weren't even trained in medical for trauma. And now we're waiting for the paramedics to arrive, and you've already bled out and died. Right. So the goal is to take this chain of survival that we used in cardiac, let's make it for trauma, and learn and teach the right people to intervene. And in my opinion, the most important people are actually the people that are there always first, and that's civilians. So it's really a whole of approach. So we're treating and teaching civilians how to treat these injuries. Then maybe a security guard, a teacher who has a little more training because of their staff can come in, do a little more care. And then your first responders usually on scene are your law enforcement. They're there to do a few things that we can talk about, but one of them is also provide care. And then ultimately paramedics, and then getting them into the operating room and giving them whole blood and surgery. But we can't just take them from that injury to a surgery room. That's just not reality. Right. And that's why all these things for this chain of survival need to be in place. So I want to stress on that.
Yeah, you brought up a good point just now, and it triggered a thought. And I'm not sure what the answer is, Kristen, but I know dispatchers go through CPR training and some first aid training because you are expected to give instructions over the phone. I think even like how to deliver a baby before officers get there, you're stabilizing the situation. Are you given trauma treatment training?
Well, for our department, we don't give out any medical training. We're not allowed to because we're not trained on it. So we transfer right away to fire dispatch in our county, and it's the fire dispatchers that do that, and they go through the cards, and I've stayed on the phone and listened to them, and they do tell them how to do CPR and those kind of things. So not every police department's the same way. So there's some dispatchers that only do medical. There's some dispatchers that do both. So I'm sure they are given some type of training for that. As far as CPR training at our agency, we've only been giving it once I think that was like over a decade ago. So it's something I need to do anyways, just to maybe take one of Ofer's classes sooner than later.
You know, what we learned with this Uvalde shooting that we didn't hear during Columbine is the students had cell phones, right? The students were calling 911 and the call centers were getting inundated. So I guess it would be hard if you're a police dispatcher to transfer the calls to fire, just repeatedly doing that. At some point, you're going to have to field those calls. So I think you're right. Ofer, do you agree it might be incumbent upon our agencies to start teaching our dispatchers to give instructions on trauma training?
I 100% agree. And think about it, we're dealing with this kind of unconventional reality. So we have to use unconventional ways of also responding. So if a call dispatch center is getting overwhelmed with giving medical information, then those calls are going to be on hold, I would imagine. I don't know all the exact vocabulary, so Kristen, chime in. But if now you're trying to transfer 200-300 calls and some of them need medical advice, imagine you who is, and not saying you specifically, but have never even used a tourniquet. Now a kid is telling you, hey, I have a tourniquet. It's on the wall. I have no idea how to use it. What a missed opportunity of dispatcher that's a 911 dispatcher that's handling maybe just that initial 911 call to not even know how to explain. I mean, we all know, we've took instructor classes. The first time you take an instructor class and they say, okay, I want you to write out how to make a sandwich. And then someone reads it and you realize that your instructions were horrible because nowhere in there it said like open the jar, and then take it with in a scooping motion and put the peanut butter on, right? So if you've
Mhm.
never even used a tourniquet, let alone open one, now you're trying to tell someone without seeing them how to articulate a major life-saving skill. It's almost impossible.
Right.
So
Mhm.
I would imagine that's something that we need to adapt to and change and modify so we can be more effective on these big incidences.
Mhm. No, I agree. I agree. And yeah, from what I understand, and that's something you bring up too, is like you have to put them on hold. So from what I understand, there was only two dispatchers in the Uvalde Police Department. I think there's only 10 total. So for the outside person who doesn't understand, like you said, there's kids calling in, right? So you only have so many lines allotted to your agency depending on how big your city is. So if these kids are calling, and then you have the parents calling, and then you just have other concerned citizens calling, you have city council calling, all these people, they're inundated with phone calls on top of they have to call out to get other people to come in because there's numerous agencies there. And then you have the one radio dispatcher trying to put out everything that they're getting taken in. I mean, they're just going to be overwhelmed. So some of those people are going to be put on hold, and it's unfortunate because yeah, you can't help everybody all at once because you have to pick up those lines too. So
Yeah. So
Yeah.
this is where I see it, and Aaron, we talked about it, is this whole chain of survival is we have to empower this community, the students, the people who are going to be there is, okay, this is how you first try to survive an active shooter or hostile event. These are some of the actions you can take. And then once it's over, this is how you start treatment. If we are kind of shying away from first talking about it, then how to even try to address it as far as survive it, of course, we're not even going to do the medical, which is a little more in detail and there's a lot of hands-on skills involved. But what a great life skill to leave students at a young age so they can take on to, from if they're learning in an elementary school, take it on to high school, then take it on to college, into your workplace, and then before you know it, they'll use it somewhere in their life.
Right.
So do you think it would be good then to like try to make it as like an actual class? Like they have homeroom, right? Or like way back when they used to have like mechanics or what was it where, you know,
Home
like
ec.
home ec kind of things. So maybe just start gradually like, hey, in elementary school, you're going to have to take this class. And then in high school, it has to be a requirement. And in college, be a requirement. You know, I don't see why that couldn't be
Yeah, it's
an
a great
elective
idea.
that they have to do.
Yeah. They teach
Yeah.
auto shop for people that want to become mechanics, woodworking for people that want to go construction. Why not teach a little bit of basic first aid for people that may want to become a doctor or nurse?
I agree. So I think you're starting to see that around some progressive states and counties that are wishing to do that. For example, we'll use an example from our area, the city of Rancho Cucamonga. They've trained all high schools on how to do the basic trauma care, but not necessarily a lot of hands-on. They at least started with showing a video. And the video was actually made by the students themselves. So we took a group of students that were in film, and they wanted to put on a video, a very educational video on how to survive an active shooter event. It was their high school project. We did this years ago, and they made this awesome video, but we put them through our training. And this is from my normal job as a firefighter medic. They did a great job by taking in that information, transferring into a video. They then demonstrated it in a video fashion to their fellow students that it will be used for years to come. And then what you do, the approach is now we show it to the entire school at once. And then first responders come into every classroom and answer any questions. When you're dealing with 3,000 kids, it's hard to do hands-on in one day. So
Yeah.
what we do is we show the video now. It's about a 10-minute video. The teacher then discusses any questions that they've had because the teacher will have a little higher education on that because we've done a class with them. And then we have at least one police officer, one firefighter walk into every classroom for the next few hours and answer any more advanced questions. It's a good way for kids to kind of get stimulated. And then they may be, hey, I want to learn more about this. And then they can seek further education. But having a dedicated, I think, true class is a wonderful idea and surely will save many lives.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the class aspect of it. When we have teachers that aspire to be teachers, they have to go through all the schooling, obviously. And I think one of the classes that we definitely need to introduce into their envelope of classes that they need to do to become certified teachers, maybe first aid as well. I don't know if it exists currently? I'd imagine it has to. Are you aware of any kind of requirement for first
So
aid?
there is some state legislation that requires first aid, like basic first aid and CPR. Every teacher has to know at least CPR. And just looking at the data, what's the number one causes of death is still heart disease, but for children, the number one cause of death is trauma. So we really our reality is not matching, what we're doing. So
Right.
trauma is still the number one cause of death in our country between 0 and 44 years old. There is on average about 45 kids killed a year in our schools from trauma, and it's specifically involving either shootings or stabbings. So, we do a lot of fire drills, and I think we've had 0 people killed in school fires in the last 60 years. So,
Yeah.
Are we matching again the reality with what's happening? Well, there's other reasons that people are not dying in fires is because we have great fire suppression systems. We have now the drills. We have signs everywhere, the materials, if you try to put something flammable in a class, that fire prevention bureau is going to be all up in your business telling you to take it down.
All
But
right.
we're doing stuff about that, but yet we're not enforcing, making sure our doors are locked, that there's a good lockdown policy in the school. I mean, I'm not trying to point at specific examples and blame, but with the recent events, I mean, there was shooting outside the school from reports. Why isn't there's some kind of immediate action for going on lockdown? I mean, in our community here, if there's a coyote near the school, they go on
Right.
lockdown, right?
Yeah.
And then, so how does that match, right? Like
Yeah.
doesn't make sense.
Yeah. We're still waiting for the actual reports to come in, accurate reports to come in. But in our last interview, the thought was the teacher did hear the shots outside, brought the students in, but failed to lock that door. And that was ultimately the door that the shooter went through. But you're absolutely right. I want to make sure our listeners didn't miss this point because it's such an important point. The statistics say that compared to fires on the campus, shootings and stabbings are more of a threat to our students than an actual fire. Yet we train and drill fire drills repeatedly more often than we do survivability drills. So you're absolutely right. It's backwards. We have it backwards right now. And I'm trying to think of the reasons why. And only that we do that. And the only thing I can think of is maybe it's still shocking to the conscious. It's maybe something that is easier to ignore than actually participate in. But we need to change that mindset today, don't we?
I agree. And I think it's, part of it is checkbox. We have a lot of bureaucracy and that, hey, we have to do this drill. And then there's also that people want to ignore the thought. A few years ago, I was on local news after a shooting we had, and they asked, like, what do you recommend? And I mentioned that there's schools that teach the run, hide, fight to kids as early as kindergarten. And when it comes to fighting, obviously you can't expect a 6 or 7-year-old to fight a grown adult. So what are some of the things that they can leverage on? Well, how we bring cans to school to have, if there's an earthquake, so they have some food. But there's a school that was doing this little red brick, and they put a red brick, everybody brings a red brick, and the kids decorate it and they keep it on their desk, and it's just like a placeholder. Well, the intent for that was that there's always red bricks available. So whether a teacher needs to grab it to try to save her or them or him from a threat, or as the kids get old, they know that, hey, teacher says, I need you to grab, if this person comes, I need you all to throw it at them. The normal instinct, if something is coming at you, is you immediately react, whether it's a piece of paper or a brick. So the ripple effect of me saying that on the news, that you need to have something to throw and our kids to fight back, was received so confrontationally and divided. We had I was speaking on behalf of our department, and as I stepped out of the studio, I had a phone call from our chief at the time, and he goes, Ofer, I don't know whether to discipline you or to commend you, because we've had phone call ringing off the hook. One person saying, I want to complain, why are you guys teaching our kids to throw bricks? And another person wanting to donate 10,000 bricks to the city. They think it's a great idea. So you see that we're, as a community, we're divided on wanting our kids to fight. But I do want to touch on, you mentioned earlier about survival, and so we want to fit that in at least today, is what is the run, hide, fight, and how do we actually implement it for, young kids versus adults? And then you asked earlier about what are the things that are killing us within trauma that we can fix. I want to somehow work that in today, because I think it's important people know what they should be training on, not just, the reality is splinting and wilderness medicine gets a lot of attention when you take these first aid classes, but it's not going to do anything for you in an active shooter. So there's a time and place to focus on that, and there's a time and place to focus on just trauma.
No, let's jump right into it. Let's elaborate more on the run, hide, fight for people that aren't familiar with that term.
So run, hide, fight came from the Homeland Security, who was trying to find something catchy and simple for a normal person at maybe a workplace to comprehend and know what they can do to survive. Because employees are saying, look, we have to have something to give our employees. If there's a shooting, we have to give them something. So run, hide, fight came from the concept of running gives you distance from the threat. So we have someone coming in shooting at a business, and you can hear the shots from far away. You can run away from the building. So that running is a great option. Obviously, you look even in big, large areas like the Route 91 shooting, running away from it was advantageous versus staying there where you can still get shot. So running is a great option. Then you have the next one is hiding. Now, hiding, I want to emphasize, is not cowering down and hiding, but hardening your soft target or hardening the target that you're in by barricading doors, locking them, shutting off lights, shutting your cell phone's ringtone, and kind of moving people out of sight and out of view. That's the whole hiding part. And another very important piece of data in our schools, there's not been a case of one active shooter breaching a locked door of a school that was truly locked. Right. So people say, well, I'm not going to lock, I'm just going to run, even if the shooter's far away. Well, the data is showing that no shooter stood there trying to actually force a door that was truly locked. Now, Virginia, they didn't lock, the doors locked from the outside. And yes, they were pushing on the doors. So eventually the shooter was able to get into most of those doors. There was one room that they put a table on the bottom, and the students pushed with their legs, and there's bullet holes all above that 30 to 40-inch mark, and none of those kids got injured, but the door never locked. So it's important to understand that why actually locking the doors and barricading does work. And then the last one is fight, meaning, okay, you're in that last life and death situation where now the shooter, the threat is right there. Saying don't shoot doesn't work. They're obviously there they know that they're probably going to die. These end usually like that. So teaching our community, our workforce to fight as your life does truly depend on it, with whatever you have, with whatever means you have, and being very aggressive. A lot of these training programs out there actually show how to do that by mechanical advantage of grabbing the weapon in a certain spot while someone else is hitting the person in the head trying to knock them out. Now, where people get confused with run, hide, fight is it's not in that order always, right? So someone like you who is off duty, let's say law enforcement, and has the means, the training, the capability, and the mindset of making a threat go away, I would truly hope in my heart that if you're in a position where you could help, you wouldn't run. You would actually go and to the fighting right away to save lives. And that's where I think people get confused, as they revert to running right away. Well, we have a lot of CCW holders. We have a lot of people who are very good at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that if they're right next to the shooter, they could probably do a lot of harm and incapacitate them, and actually keep them probably safe, and others safe if they intervene. So sometimes it's not sequential, but more of pick and choose the run, hide, fight part that's best suited for that environment and your own situation.
Yes, it's not an escalating
it's on a checklist.
Right. You don't start with run and then eventually elevate to hide. These are options for you to do. So you've got to consider these options in a tool bag. You're going to pick the right tool for the right situation. So I just want our listeners to understand that, we don't want to mistake them, because years ago, a lot of our listeners are cops. And years ago, the use of force matrix for law enforcement wasn't escalating. You started here and you moved to the next, and we learned that was ineffective and actually got officers hurt. So now the use of force training matrix shows these available force options to us that are in a tool bag, and you use the appropriate option. So for our listeners listening to this run, hide, fight, yes, it's a catchy term that Homeland Security made, but it's not necessarily in a sequential order.
Yeah. And then I do just want to talk about, since you asked it earlier, is what is actually killing our folks. So there's basically 4 things that, thousands of patients and injuries, both on the battlefield and civilians, have shown us that there's really 4 types of injuries that we can actually fix very quickly and simply in the field. And anything past that is very advanced. And, if you don't have a surgeon there or whole blood and things like that, you're not going to be able to make a difference. So
Right.
If you're going to a program to learn Stop the Bleed and you leave there without learning these 4 things, then you obviously didn't get what you bargained for, right? So I just want to touch on those. And those are the following. So for example, I use the term save because it's easy for me to remember, and then I teach it as save. So S is stop the bleed. So the stop the bleed part is in areas where if you don't stop the bleed, because all bleeding eventually stops, but there's certain bleeding that you have to stop right away, and that's the major bleeds, and that's usually arterial, and it's indicated by bright blood that's spurting out with your heart rate. So the number one place that happens is usually the arms and leg, and a person will bleed within about a minute and a half from an artery that's severed, and they'll die if you don't stop it. So the type of treatment for that is a simple tourniquet, as long as you go above that wound. If you're not in a threatening environment, a few inches above it is fine. If you're in a threatening environment and you don't remember what 2 to 3 inches looks like, then just go all the way on the top of the limbs. So you really only have, if you want to dedicate yourself to memory, is I'm going to put a tourniquet. There's only 4 spots you put it, as high as you can on the right, left arm, right, left leg, 4 spots to put a tourniquet. Then you have the bleeding that is just above that, and it's in the junctions, and that's critical bleeding too. So in the neck area here, and which is actually a very common spot for law enforcement, in the armpits, and then in the groin. Why is this common for law enforcement? As you guys know, a lot of folks will wear a white shirt, and it's almost like this perfect triangle. And then just the way the bullets, if they do hit your armor, it could kind of skip up towards the neck. And the same with the armpits here, as it's always kind of an open spot. So in the armpit area, all these areas, tourniquet won't work. And those are areas where we pack wounds. That is one of the biggest game changers, is teaching. We're teaching maybe 10, 15 years ago, we were teaching paramedics, and now we're teaching it. I did it to my girl's 9-year-old Girl Scout troop, and they did it awesome. You bring these little devices that help them learn how to pack and keep pressure on that artery. So packing these areas is crucial, and that's all part of that S of the stop the bleed. And if you do have an injury on the arm that's bleeding fast, but it's not arterial, eventually if you let it keep going, they'll die too. So any bleed you have to address right away. Now, if it's a slow bleed and there's other injuries, then address those first and come back to that slow bleed later. So that's the S. A for the save is airway. Unfortunately, you get knocked out from a trauma. Maybe it was you got hit in the head. You're going to be unconscious. If you're laying flat and your tongue falls back into your airway, you're going to basically suffocate and die. Just like that cardiac arrest patient we talked about is not breathing. And the simple treatment for that is laying him on their side. Either side is fine. As you get more advanced, we have other airway things we can use, and do a surgical airway or intubate them. But for a civilian, for a law enforcement officer, just putting someone on their side in that recovery position, there's plenty of videos of how to do that, is truly a life-saving intervention. So that's the A. The next one is V. And this is where it's the biggest difference between law enforcement and military and civilians. So civilians don't have body armor, and it's the biggest target. If you were to go in and you're not experienced even, and you go in to shoot in a movie theater, you're going to have most of your shots land in the torso. It's just proven data, because that's the bigger area that's exposed and showing you as a target. So civilians tend to have more injuries in the torso than they do in the extremities, where law enforcement tend to have more life and death injuries to the extremities because they have body armor. So we see a big shift in injuries. And one of the biggest data that was found was from the Pulse nightclub shooting. They did the autopsies on those. and they found that there was a certain amount of patients that showed trauma to the chest that that could have possibly been saved. And there was obviously other injuries that people bleeding out for logistics reasons. They didn't go into the bathrooms thinking there was a threat. So these people did bleed out. But we found that we're teaching civilians to cover these holes, these wounds in the torso. And this one is a tricky one for some. So think about anywhere there is lung or ribs behind it on the skin, then that needs to be covered with a vented chest seal. The beauty is for law enforcement, you guys have the body armor there. A bullet still could travel underneath. It's important to lift it for your viewers. Lift that body armor, check, look for holes in blood, cover that up with a vented seal. And we use vented seals because that allows the air to come out, but not come in. That way it doesn't build more pressure in the chest. But we see this as one of the number one cause of death in civilians. And it's not the number one cause of death for law enforcement and military because they have body armor. And then the last one is the E for save, and that's the environment, meaning keeping them warm. Hyperthermia is one of the things that even myself as a paramedic, I've failed traditionally the longest in treating because like, look, today it's probably super hot where you guys are. We don't think of the body being cold, but when you lose a certain amount of blood, that helps you keep your body temperature. We lose that blood, the body temperature has a direct correlation to how we clot. So the colder your temperature is, you get to a point where you can no longer build a blood clot. So you might be pushing on someone's bleeding vessel, but their body temperature is now 92, 91 degrees. You're not creating any clot. There's all the science behind it and the chemistry of why, but the reality is if they're cold, they're not going to clot. So we have to keep them warm. So that's why if you don't learn how to keep someone warm, open their airway, put chest seals on that are vented and stop all those bleeds with the different techniques, then you're not getting a good stop the bleed class. And then the next is you're really not going to be able to know what to do to save someone. But these are truly the four things that we can do as both civilians and first responders to save lives that are savable in the field.
That's valuable stuff. And I want to stress to our listeners that you can go on YouTube, you can go on the internet, you can go on social media, you can go to Ofer's website, High Threat Innovations, and maybe pick up on these things, but nothing will beat actually physically doing this. Muscle memory is so important that you actually have to physically train how to pack a wound, how to apply a tourniquet, so that when you're in a high stress situation, your body reverts to muscle memory. Your body always reverts to training. So I want to stress to our listeners that you should sign up for a class. Ofer Lichtman's classes are available online. There's a big schedule of where you can do it. Ofer may be coming to you, your corporate or your companies that you work for may hire High Threat Innovations to come in and instruct these classes. So if anybody's interested in hiring High Threat Innovations or contracting with High Threat Innovations, where can they get this information from your website?
Yeah, our website or even our Instagram. We'll reach out. I'll personally be contacting you, and we'll figure out what's best for you and your agency. Or we do again a lot of law enforcement, fire training for those agencies, and then we do a lot of businesses that want to learn and prepare their folks. Obviously, the past few weeks have been busy because people are realizing, wow, we're not prepared. Had multiple schools reach out to us saying, you know what, our parents are asking, and we realize we don't even have a policy other than just lockdown for everything. And lockdown for everything is not the answer. I mean, there's lockdown, there's lockout, there's shelter in place, and I think we can all do a better job of being better at the medical stuff. And I know in your earlier podcast, you mentioned, you talked about mindset, but that's part of it too, is realizing that just because I'm a first responder doesn't mean I'm great at medicine. And just like I wouldn't know anything close to what you would know about firearms, but I'm considered a first responder. So someone would think, I will never have to deal with a firearm. I don't need to do that. Well, we should put our egos aside and, be uncomfortable of learning other skills.
Absolutely. It's better to have more acquired skills than just specialize in one. You hear this term, jack of all trades, master of none, and people usually think that's a negative connotation, but actually it's a pretty good idea to have your hands into different aspects what you might encounter. Physical training, firearm training, life-saving training. So as we've learned, I learned something new today. SAVE is something that I'm going to take away with me. Very applicable and applicable in many situations. So thank you for that. I think it's something our listeners definitely are going to take away from.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I know we can probably go hours. We can elaborate on everything, including individual portions of SAVE, but I want to save that for if a proposed roundtable panel where we're going to have experts in the field, and we'd love to have you on. And we can discuss this amongst professionals. But for our listeners, if you want to learn more, you can follow Ofer Lichtman on social media. On Instagram, he's Trauma Pack, pack with a K, not a CK. And you can go directly to his website, High Threat Innovations. You can Google that and it'll come up. Ofer graciously gave us his time. He appears on local and national news. He's doing corporate events. He teaches other first responders how to do this. So we're lucky to have you, Ofer. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for coming
Absolutely.
on again.
And thank you guys for what you do. And, it's all one team effort. So thank you.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. It is a team effort. And I'm glad that, I think you mentioned it, egos aside, egos sometimes interfere with productivity. But I'm so glad that we're able to find people like you that are willing to come. I know traditionally firefighters and police officers don't necessarily see eye to eye, but I think we find that if we work together, we can be more productive than when there's friction. So thanks for being such a down-to-earth firefighter, paramedic. I wish more were like you.
I've always had a great relationship with, it's funny because my brother-in-law is, he works for a large police department in Southern California, and his counterparts in the fire are not the same. And I tell him, I think it's really the environment you're in.
Yes.
We foster a very cohesive environment with our law enforcement. I teach with them all the time, and to us, it's a family. And I mean, they come in and out of our stations. They drink our coffee. They make jokes about us in front of us at the station, and they eat with it. I mean, it's been a blessing, and it pays dividends when these critical calls happen. You're tied to the hip and making critical decisions, but you already have that trust in place. That could be a great idea for a future podcast, but how do we improve relations? I think it's showing both the top management, and then it starts at the bottom of the boots on the ground working together.
Absolutely. Don't let politics interfere with productivity. All right.
Exactly.
Well, that's it for this episode. I know we could have probably gone a couple more hours, but instead of doing that, I'm going to take advantage and bring you back one day, Ofer, if you're willing to.
Sounds great.
All right. Well,
All right.
Thank you guys for listening. We know you have your choice to listen to just about anybody, but we want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts, inviting us into your homes, your offices, and on your commutes. And we appreciate you sharing our podcast. I shared this information with Kristen yesterday. But for the first time in our podcast history, we made the international top 5 on the Apple podcast charts. In Europe, I think we're number 3 in one of the countries and number 5 in another country. So thank you. Our international presence is growing, but we appreciate those listening in the States as well. Our rankings are not as high as in the States, but our ranking is there. So thanks to you guys. We couldn't have done that without you guys and your support and your continual sharing of our podcast. So thank you. And thank you for listening. And we'll get you next time on the 911 Strong podcast. Bye-bye.
Bye.